You probably think you know the story of the World Wars. But what if one of the biggest catastrophes of that entire era has been almost completely erased from the history books? Today, we're diving into the story of a neutral country that was caught in the crossfire and the staggering consequences that, believe it or not, are still being felt today.
Just try to imagine a disaster on the scale of the absolute worst events of the 20th century, but it's one you probably never even heard of. And we're not talking about ancient history here. This all happened during World War I and World War II. So the central mystery we're going to unpack is, how does a catastrophe this massive just vanish from the story?
To really get a sense of the scale we're talking about, just look at this number, up to 17 million. That's the combined high-end estimate for the death toll of two separate famines that hit Iran during the World Wars. A number like that should put these events right up there with the deadliest of the century. And yet, they're barely a historical footnote.
All right, so let's start with that first catastrophe. Just how big was the famine during World War I? And why is there still such a fierce debate raging about it among historians?
So during World War I, this absolutely devastating famine just sweeps through Iran. But here's what makes it so shocking. Iran was officially neutral. It had formally declared that it would not be taking part in the conflict. But as we're about to find out, that declaration meant very, very little to the warring powers.
Now, this is where things get really wild. There is a massive disagreement on the actual human cost. For decades, most historians put the number at around 2 million dead. But then, some groundbreaking research by an economist named Mohammad Goli Maj, who dug deep into old U.S. diplomatic archives, suggested a number that was just astronomically higher. 8 to 10 million people. That could have been half the country's population at the time. And a huge gap like that is at the very heart of why this history is so contested and why it's been so easy to just ignore.
But the crazy thing is, this wasn't just a one-off tragedy. To understand how something like this could even happen, we need to look at the political context and a really devastating pattern of Iran's sovereignty being completely ignored.
So, let's go back to August 1914. The Great War is just starting, and Iran's government makes its position crystal clear. We are a neutral party. But here's the thing. By this point, Iran was already really weakened. Britain and Russia had already kind of carved the country into their own spheres of influence years earlier. So its neutrality was, let's just say it was more of an aspiration than a reality.
And the result was immediate. Russian, British, and Ottoman troops just moved onto Iranian soil anyway. They didn't treat the country like a sovereign state, but more like a convenient battlefield and a supply depot.
Okay, now fast forward 2 decades. The world is on the brink of another global war. And again, Iran takes the exact same official position, neutrality. They wanted absolutely no part in the conflict that was coming. And again, it was a declaration that was completely disregarded. In 1941, the Allied forces, Britain and the Soviet Union, invaded. Why? To secure a supply line to Russia, which became known as the Persian Corridor. It's just this tragic echo of history, right? Iran's neutrality violated for the second time in a single generation.
This all raises a really crucial question. How exactly did foreign occupation turn into mass starvation? Let's unravel the specific mechanics that turned armies on Iranian soil into two of the worst famines in modern history.
During World War I, it was like a domino effect of devastating decisions. First, the occupying armies settled right in Iran's breadbasket regions, the most fertile farmland. Then, they started requisitioning huge amounts of grain and livestock for their own troops, which immediately created shortages for the Iranian people. But then came the critical blow. According to U.S. diplomatic cables from the time, British authorities were actively blocking food imports that could have brought relief. The result was this absolute death spiral of hyperinflation, food hoarding, and ultimately starvation on an unimaginable scale.
Now, in World War II, the mechanism was a little different, but it was just as deadly. The Allies needed to move war supplies to the Soviet Union. So to do that, they took over the Trans-Iranian Railway, the country's main transportation artery. They also commandeered about 75% of the trucks that were needed to move food from the farms to the cities. This didn't just create shortages, it completely shattered the country's entire distribution network. You had this horrific situation where food would literally be rotting in one part of the country while people were starving to death in another. And the official attitude from the Allies at the time? It was shockingly clear. Even as this catastrophe was unfolding during World War II, the American ambassador, Louis Dreyfus, reported back to Washington that Iran was, and I quote, not suffering from a serious famine, and he recommended against prioritizing any relief efforts. His assessment was so catastrophically wrong, and it just reveals a stark truth. The welfare of Iranian civilians was simply not a priority. Iran was seen as a corridor, not a country full of people.
This brings us to probably the most difficult question in this entire story. Was this a deliberate, genocidal policy, or was it the result of a monstrous and criminal indifference? There are really two main ways of looking at this, and both are damning. One argument, put forward by researchers like Maud, is that British policy, especially in World War I, was an intentional act, that blocking food imports was a conscious decision where they knew the predictable and lethal consequences. The other view argues it was a result of criminally negligent indifference, that the Allies prioritized their military logistics so completely that they just did not care that millions of civilians would die as a result. A moral failure so profound it's hard to distinguish it from actual malice. So, all this leads us to our final section, the high price of silence. Why is a tragedy of this magnitude almost completely unknown? And what has been the lasting impact of this history being erased? Well, there are several reasons this history got buried. First, the winners of World War II wrote the popular histories, and a story about them causing a famine that killed millions just didn't fit the heroic narrative. Second, key British archives on the subject were sealed for decades, preventing anyone from doing independent research. Academically, Iran was always treated as a sideshow, not a central part of the story, so its experience was marginalized. And finally, because this history has been used for political purposes in modern Iran, some Western historians have tended to just dismiss the claims rather than actually investigate them seriously. But if there's one piece of data that just cuts through all the debate, it's this. Take a look at the timeline. Between 1900 and 1944, Iran's population growth was essentially zero, flat. For nearly half a century, the country did not grow.
I mean, that just reveals the profound demographic scar that was left on the country. For almost 50 years, a nation that should have been growing was just held in place by these disasters, one after another. This stagnation isn't some contested estimate, it's a demographic fact. It's written in the absence of millions of people who were never born or who died way too young.
And this, right here, is the ultimate takeaway. This forgotten history didn't just fade away inside Iran. This deep-seated experience of violation, of being occupied and starved by foreign powers, it became a powerful force in Iranian politics. It fueled a nationalist grievance that was absolutely central to the worldview of the 1979 revolution, and it continues to shape Iranian attitudes towards the West even today.
And that leaves us with a final question to think about. The history of these famines is such a powerful reminder that the stories we tell about war are choices. They include some people and they erase others. And that act of choosing who to remember and who to forget, that's one of the most profound powers that history has.